Okay, Year 10, so today we're going to start Stave 3, entitled The Second of the Three Spirits. So the spirit we're going to meet in today's reading is the ghost of Christmas present. So the ghost who will show Scrooge the Christmas that is happening or will be happening on that day where he's being visited by the spirits themselves. Okay, so as always, you need to make sure that you have a highlighter at the ready. You need to make sure you've got a pen at the ready. Before we start reading, you need to make sure that you've gone and completed your knowledge quiz based on the second half of Stave 2. So if you've not done that, go do that now. Okay, my lovelies, let's start reading. So this is Stave 3. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he had turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as hardly as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, and yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at that very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked like the perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or from many and many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oyster, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and seething bowls of punch, that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Okay, so, your first quote is a jolly giant. So we've got happiness of Christmas. Okay, so Christmas is meant to be a celebration. So he embodies that celebratory spirit of Christmas. So he is the spirit of Christmas because he's jolly. Okay, but you've also got giant. And I would say that this fits into the semantic field of plenty. Okay. So, for example, in contrast with Scrooge's tiny fire in his office, you've got a mighty blaze, so, in abundance. You've got giant, connoting size, you've got plenty, heaped, so all these birds, like, great joints of meat, so a huge pile of food, essentially. So we've got a semantic field of plenty linked to the giant. So the giant embodies size and mass and having lots of something rather than being small and withering. Okay. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before this spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he'd been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I'm the ghost of Christmas present," said the Scrooge. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. Oh, it looks like Santa. So Santa, Father Christmas, St. Nicholas, he used to wear green before Coca-Cola decided to turn his outfit red. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and then with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You've never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. So this description here essentially is telling us that he is super, super jolly. Okay, so he's a happy ghost, unlike the ghost we're going to meet in Stave 4. Okay, up to the top of page 33 now. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these later years," pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. So his brothers that he talks about, there is one ghost of Christmas present every Christmas. So if he's got over 1,800 brothers, suggests that the counting began with the birth of Christ, Christmas. So every year there's a new ghost. So we assume that this ghost is only going to be here for this one day only. It's only there for Christmas. "Spirit," says Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe!" Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, pudding, fruit and punch, all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down onto the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. So the ghost has taken Scrooge out onto the street on Christmas Day. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and waggons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off, and made intricate channels hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms. And sorry, I've just realised you can't see what I'm reading. Sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire and were blazing away to their dear heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to diffuse in vain. 4. The people who were shovelling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile, far than many wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. So people having snowball fights. Very happy it's Christmas Day. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shells in wonted slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squat and swarthy, setting off the yellows of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth amongst these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race, appeared to know there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. So this paragraph, you don't need to really know it. All you need to know is that the scene that Dickens is describing is one of plenty. So it is a scene of the shops open on the street as they're walking down the street in London, and the imagery is of lots of lovely food that just looks great. So that's it, just imagery of plenty. That's all you need to know for this. So don't worry if you're not following it. It's just a description of food in the shops. Okay, let's shuffle up. The grocers. Oh, the grocers! Nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses! It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee was so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar, as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day, that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humour possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection and for Christmas doors to peck at as they chose. Don't worry about this paragraph if you don't get it. It's more imagery of food. I don't know what Dickens was thinking. He probably had a few pages to fill, and he just went, gonna do a paragraph describing the food. A bit like when we do story writing, you've got to fill that 5-paragraph structure. Do a description of what you can see. I can see all this food in great detail. So Dickens is just fill-in time, I personally think. I don't think this is important to the plot of the story, as long as you know that he's describing plenty, he's describing an abundance of food, because that's, something that Christmas is about. It's about overeating. Of course, we will have a contrast at the end of the chapter, or at the end of the stave, when we see that there are some people who do not have plenty, some people have want, so they go hungry. Okay, so it's worth bearing that in mind, that there's a juxtaposition with the end of the stave. But let's continue. So we're at the bottom of page 34. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes, and with their gayest faces. Gayest means happiest, guys. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appears to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge behind him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once and twice when there was angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was, God love it, so it was. In the time the bells ceased and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners in the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each bacon's oven, where the pavement smoked as if stones were cooking too. "Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is. My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." "Spirit," said Scrooge after a moment's thought, "I wonder you, of all the beings in many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment." "I?" cried the Spirit. "You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day in which they can be said to dine at all," said Scrooge. "Wouldn't you?" "I?" cried the Spirit. "You seek to close these places on the seventh day," said Scrooge, "and it comes to the same thing." "I seek!" exclaimed the Spirit. "Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family." "There are some upon this earth of yours," returned the Spirit, "who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us." So, Scrooge asks the Spirit, who is clearly, a Christmas guy, Christian, religious, linked to Jesus, why, in Jesus's or religion's name, why is everything closed on a Sunday? It deprives some people of food. People aren't allowed to work and make money. It's like, so Scrooge says, well, why are you depriving these people when they could be getting food, etc. on a Sunday? And the Spirit says, hey, some people do things in the name of Christianity that we do not support. So do not blame me if your selfish men twist the Bible, twist religion to their own selfish purposes. That's essentially what he means. Okay? Let's carry on. We're on what page are we on? We're on page 36, I think. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on invisible as they had been before into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood below a low roof, quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the good Spirit had in showing off his power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk's, for there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding his robe, and onto the threshold of the door the Spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of the torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He'd pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. So, I think Dickens is taking on kind of Scrooge's thoughts here. So Bob Cratchit makes 15 bob a week, that's £15 a week. So bob is a colloquial term for pounds. And yet the ghost of Christmas present still blesses him, even though he doesn't have very much. So Scrooge is learning that it's not just the rich who deserve favour and blessing. The poor deserve it more than others. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughter, also brave in ribbons, while Mr. Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honour of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peach Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. Right, so not a flashcard quote, but I think this one is great. So dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown. So it's been fixed, or the material has been used to have the dress remade twice. Okay, so people would often take a dress. Sorry, the recording cut out there. People would often take a dress that had been owned by someone richer, and they had outworn, so it had become worn and maybe a little bit tatty, and then they would alter it for themselves. So maybe take out some of the damaged bits, make something simpler. And there was a whole chain of kind of reusing and recycling in the Victorian era of clothes. So a dress would start off with someone rich, and then it would get passed down to someone who would alter it, and then it'd get passed down again, so until it got to rags. It got to the poorest members of society and turned into rags. Now the phrase brave in ribbons relates to the fact that this dress is old, it's tatty, so Mrs. Cratchit covers it up with ribbons. So she's making do and mending, and she's got a positive mindset. She thinks that if she can cover up the tattiness with ribbons, then that's good enough for her. So she's not someone who's greedy or selfish. So it says great in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence. Okay, so we're going to carry on with the reading now. "What has ever got your precious father then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha warn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah, there's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye." "No, there's father coming," cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Okay, so we're going to annotate the quote "a little crutch," because Tiny Tim and his physical weakness, his kind of lameness is and the fact that he relies on the crutch is a symbol for the poor and how they are reliant upon support, and the support systems that are in place are not making them sort of strong again. So Tiny Tim and his little crutch are a symbol for the poor and how they are weak and how they are sort of in need of that support. So I've put symbol, how his weakness and his malnourishment is symbolic of the needs of the poor. Okay, so let's carry on. So Bob, no, I'm not carrying on yet. I'm apparently still talking about this quote. "Why, where's old Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he'd been Tim's blood horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off in the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much." and thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Okay, so we're going to annotate that he hoped the people saw him in the church, and then to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Okay, so we've got the imagery there of miracles, Christ performing miracles, making the lame walk, making the blind see. However, we've also got this specific image of blind men, which I think is an allusion to Scrooge and his blindness, metaphorical, and the fact that he needs to be awoken. We've also got this Christian selfless sentiment coming from Tiny Tim. So Tiny Tim is the most Christian of all the characters, thinks not of himself but of others and of their kind of salvation. So Tiny Tim, whilst in poverty, is seen to be good and wholesome. So linked to this kind of allusion to Scrooge, him being blind to the truth. Obviously the whole book is about his awakening, shows that an awakening or an ability to see is needed. Just going to wait for annotating Mrs. Dougall to catch up with talking Mrs. Dougall. Okay, so we're going to pick up with Bob's voice was tremulous. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Apparently I want you to pause the recording so you can get those annotations down. So I'll just let reading Mrs. Dougall catch up. His active little crutch, that's repetition, was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Not sure why I'm turning over. Mrs. Dougall in the past had a point to make about that, but I can't remember what it was. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was becoming very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for a goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" So, there are a lot of long sentences in this paragraph, and I think those long flowing sentences represent that overflow of excitement and their gratitude, that overflow of gratitude for the food they are about to eat. So do make a note of that. Pause if you need to get it down. Okay, and I'm sure in a second we're going to continue with the reading. There was never such a goose. Come on, Mrs. Dougall, we're waiting on you. There was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. I'm still not sure why I'm not moving on the screen. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. So eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it shows that they don't have enough meat to go round, which was quite expensive. So they're trying to stretch it out with cheap materials like applesauce and mashed potatoes. So that's what it means by eked out, stretched out. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Supposing somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she'd had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought that it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. So they are heaping compliments on Mrs. Cratchit to make her feel that the pudding's sufficient. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as the golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dear, God bless us," which the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon the little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, which I hope he does, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from us. Okay, so we're going to highlight withered little hand. We've got further imagery of weakness, malnourishment, but at the same time, you know, the hand, because it's so withered and because it's weak, he's harmless. He's got no strength and no power to him. So the poor are treated as if they are these fearful creatures, but in their weakness they are powerless and harmless to the rich. So the rich shouldn't be trying to keep them down. So I'll just let you copy that down. Okay, so we're going to move on to Scrooge. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he'd never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." Now we're going to highlight "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." So we've got this imperative sentence, but we'll do that at the end. "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in a poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "Oh, no, no, no," said Scrooge. "No, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then?" "If he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. Right, so 3 things we're going to highlight here.
Tell me if Tiny Tim will live. Say he will be spared, and if he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. So those first two are both imperatives. So that demanding, that commanding that he's doing shows his desperation. Tell me, say it. You know, he's really desperate to hear what he wants to hear. So it shows he's invested. And then we've got, if he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. That repetition of Scrooge's words from Stave 1 are used in Stave 3 to track his change. So by echoing his words, we see how far he has come since he said them. So it also emphasises Scrooge's shame. So in Stave 1 he was proud to say those words. Now he is ashamed to hear those words. Okay, Year 10. So that's all the reading for today. So make sure you've got these annotations down and get your flashcards at the ready. I'll do the first one with you. Year 10. So we're going to go through our first flashcard together before I leave you to do the rest yourself. So I'm sorry about the light. I'm in my loft and it's still quite bright today. So we're going to look at the quote Jolly Giant because I think it's quite a hard one to analyse. So let's turn over and start on this side and we'll do the 5 W's. So where, who, what, when and why. Okay, so where is the quote from? Well, it's from the start of Stave 3. It's the introduction of the ghost. Okay, so that's the ghost of Christmas present. Who? It describes the ghost of... Now, I'm going to write Xmas because I'm lazy. You can write Christmas if you want. The ghost of Christmas present. What? Well, it's a physical description, isn't it? Okay, when? So it's the second visit. An hour. It's from an hour after the ghost was due. Scrooge lay in bed for ages before he realised it was in the room next door. Okay, and why? Right, so why does Dickens describe this? To suggest significance of Christmas, and we'll get onto that on the other side. Okay, so sorry about this. Hope you can read that. If you need to copy that down, please pause now. Okay, so let's get on to the other side. So we've got a jolly giant. So we're going to start with jolly, which is an adjective. Represents the joyful nature of Christmas. So Christmas is meant to be a celebration, isn't it? It's not meant to be a horrible time. It's meant to be a celebration of the birth of Jesus. So jolly reminds us of that. Okay, so the imagery, which is our technique, of a giant links to the semantic field of plenty, which links to the abundance of Christmas. So people have things in abundance at Christmas. So people have big dinners, they give lots of food. You know, it's a time where people give in abundance, they consume in abundance. And I think subtly Dickens's message is to draw attention to the gap between those who celebrate to excess and those who at Christmas suffer the worst. So Dickens emphasises gap between rich who have plenty and poor who suffer. Okay, so our context.
So the ghost represents Christianity, England was still majority Christian. So this would appeal to Dickens's readers. Yeah, Britain's still a very Christian country. Lots of people still going to church every Sunday. It even mentions in this chapter about the ringing of the church bells, and that's time for people to go to church for their services. So Bob Cratchit, for example, brings Tiny Tim back from the church service on Christmas Day. Mrs. Cratchit, however, does not go because she's too busy cooking. Told you. Dickens a bit sexist, isn't he? Making the women cook while the blokes go gallivanting off to church. Right. So hopefully that has helped you get started on the rest of your flashcards. Well done Year 10 for another great lesson. If you're in my class, make sure you send me pictures of your flashcards. If you're in